Hey everyone, before we dive into today's stories, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It'll really help you get more thrilling and spine-chilling stories like this. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and let's see how far our story listeners reach. I never liked big crowds, but the idea of taking a cruise seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime chance to step away from my routine. I was 31, burned out from work, and the thought of staring at nothing but ocean for days sounded peaceful. I booked it last minute, packed light, and told myself I'd finally learn how to switch off my phone and not think about emails. From the moment I stepped aboard, I felt the sheer size of the ship swallowing me. It wasn't just a boat, it was a floating city. Hundreds of cabins, restaurants, theaters, pools, families dragging suitcases, couples posing for pictures, workers scanning cards at the entry gate. Everyone had this excited energy, like they were about to enter another world. I tried to match that energy, but the truth was, I felt like an outsider. My cabin was small, clean, tucked deep into one of the lower decks where you could feel the thrum of the engines through the floor. It didn't bother me. I thought the low humming might even help me sleep. That first night, I wandered the ship until nearly midnight. The air was warm, the sea flat as glass, and most of the passengers had either gone to the shows or to bed. I liked the emptiness. I found myself leaning on the railing at the back of the ship, just staring at the black stretch of water behind us. That was when I noticed him. A man, standing 2 decks below, alone. He wasn't looking out at the water. He was facing the ship, head tilted up, like he was watching me. It unsettled me enough that I stepped back, pretending to check my phone, but when I glanced down again, he was gone. I told myself not to overthink it. It was a big ship. People came and went. Still, something about the way he had just stood there, so still, staring, it didn't sit right. The next morning, breakfast was chaotic, crowded with families and loud groups. I grabbed a plate and found a seat at the far end of the buffet. That was when I saw him again. The same man. Mid-40s maybe, salt and pepper hair, plain clothes. He sat 2 tables away, no plate, no drink, just sitting, looking in my direction. My first thought was, maybe I'm imagining this. Maybe he just happened to sit there. But then he smiled, not a friendly smile, more like someone acknowledging that I'd noticed him. I got up and left, telling myself to shake it off. By the second night, I couldn't ignore it. He appeared everywhere. In the hallway outside my cabin, leaning casually like he belonged there. In the lounge, sitting alone at the edge of a crowd. At the pool deck, where I caught him watching me from behind a row of chairs. Always silent, always still. What scared me most was that nobody else seemed to notice him. I asked one of the crew, a woman who worked housekeeping, if she'd seen a man matching his description. She frowned and said, "Cabin number?" I admitted I didn't know. She just shrugged. "Lots of passengers. Maybe you just keep bumping into him." But it wasn't bumping into him. It was calculated. On the 3rd night, I returned to my cabin late. I slid the keycard into the lock, pushed the door open, and froze. The lights were on. I knew I'd left them off. My bag, which I'd left zipped, sat open on the bed, clothes folded neatly beside it, like someone had unpacked for me. My chest tightened. I checked the bathroom, the tiny closet. Nobody there. The air felt different, though, like the room had been lived in. I reported it to the front desk. The woman behind the counter was polite but dismissive. Sometimes crew checks luggage if there's a maintenance issue. That doesn't make sense, I argued. They unpacked my stuff. She gave me this practiced smile. If anything else happens, please let us know. I walked away furious, but also afraid, because what if it wasn't the crew? What if it was him? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the walls, every distant footstep in the corridor kept me awake. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that froze me completely, a knock on my door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. Another knock. Then silence. I sat in the dark until morning, barely breathing. The next day, I tried to convince myself to relax. It was paranoia, I told myself. The ship was huge, full of strangers. Maybe I was projecting. Maybe I just wasn't used to being around this many people. That illusion shattered when I stepped into the elevator to head to lunch. The doors closed, and when I turned, he was standing inside with me. I hadn't seen him when I entered. I swear to this day he wasn't there when I walked in. We stood side by side in silence as the elevator hummed upward. He didn't press a button. His hands hung loose at his sides, head slightly tilted toward me. The ride felt endless. Finally, I forced myself to ask, "Do I know you?" He smiled that same unsettling smile. Not yet. The doors opened. I bolted out. For the rest of the day, I kept to the most crowded areas, by the pool, the theater, anywhere with noise and people. But it didn't matter. Whenever I glanced around, he was there. Not close, not approaching, just present, always watching. I stopped eating. I barely slept. Every corner of the ship felt smaller, tighter. The ocean, which had first felt freeing, now felt like a trap. There was no leaving, no escape. On the fifth night, something happened that made me realize I wasn't imagining anything. I came back to my cabin after dinner and found a note on my pillow. Not typed, not official. Handwritten in shaky block letters. "You shouldn't be here." My knees almost gave out. I locked the door, shoved the desk chair under the handle, and sat in the corner, clutching the note. At dawn, I stormed down to the front desk, slammed the paper down, and demanded answers. The staff member looked at it, frowned, then shook her head. "Sir, this isn't from us." "I know it's not from you," I snapped. "Somebody got into my cabin, again." She promised to have security check the logs. I never heard back. By then, I started questioning more than just my safety. I questioned my sanity. I'd look at groups of people and wonder if they saw him too, or if he existed only for me. On the sixth night, I broke. I went drinking at one of the bars, anything to drown out the paranoia. By the time I stumbled back toward my cabin, the hallways were empty, quiet. My keycard wouldn't work. I tried again and again until I heard a voice behind me. "You don't belong here." I turned, and he was there, standing at the end of the hall. I dropped the card. My pulse hammered. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. He tilted his head, smiling faintly. Then he stepped closer. I ran. Not to my cabin, not to safety. I just ran. Down stairwells, through corridors, past empty lounges. I didn't stop until I reached the upper deck, where the cold night air hit me. I collapsed by the railing, gasping, my stomach heaving. When I looked up, he was there too. Closer this time. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes, something sharp, hungry. I don't know how long I stood frozen before a couple walked past, laughing, completely oblivious. When I turned back, he was gone. That was the last night I saw him. The next morning, the ship docked. I didn't even eat breakfast. I was off that ship before half the passengers were awake, dragging my bag down the gangway like my life depended on it. I told myself it was over, that maybe it had been some twisted prank or my own exhausted mind playing tricks. I checked into a cheap hotel, locked the door, and slept 16 hours straight. When I woke up, the world felt normal again. I wasn't the kind of person who ever thought I'd end up on a cruise ship. Growing up, the closest thing we had to vacation was piling into my dad's old pickup and driving 3 hours to some lake where the water was too cold to swim in. But after a rough year, my marriage falling apart, losing my job, and drinking too much, I figured maybe I needed something drastic, something to reset me. So when a friend forwarded me a last-minute deal on a week-long Alaskan cruise, I bought the ticket without thinking. I boarded alone. That already felt strange. Cruise ships are full of couples, families, groups of friends laughing over drinks. I was just a guy with a backpack, a duffel bag, and no one waiting for me on board. The ship was huge, bigger than I expected. Inside it was like a floating city, restaurants, bars, casinos, shops, pools, everything designed to keep people distracted. Everyone seemed to be buzzing with excitement, but for me, the hum of so many strangers only reminded me of how alone I was. The first 2 days, I kept to myself. I walked the decks, ate dinners by the windows, watched the water stretch endlessly around us. At night, I'd go up top, away from the music and chatter, and just stare at the dark ocean. That's when I started noticing something. Every night, around the same time, there was a man who stood on the far end of the upper deck. Always alone, always leaning on the railing, staring down at the water. He wasn't one of the regular tourists. He never joined in the pool games, the shows, the karaoke nights. He just appeared on that same stretch of deck after midnight, in a dark jacket, barely moving. I wouldn't have paid much attention. People do strange things. But the second night, when I walked past him, he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his face. Pale, almost gray with deep shadows under his eyes. The way he looked at me wasn't casual. It was sharp, measuring, like he knew me from somewhere. I hurried past, telling myself I was imagining things. The third night, he was there again. Same spot, same stillness. But this time, when I stepped onto the deck, I realized I was the only one out there with him. The rest of the ship seemed asleep. The ocean was black, rolling quietly, the stars buried behind clouds. I walked toward the railing, pretending not to notice him, but I could feel his eyes on me. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, steady. "You ever think about how easy it'd be to disappear out here?" I froze. My hands tightened on the cold railing. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at him. I just stood there, pretending to watch the water. He took a slow step closer. "One push. That's all it takes. Nobody would ever find you. They wouldn't even know until it was too late." I glanced at him then. His expression didn't change. No smirk, no laugh, just those hollow eyes fixed on me. I muttered something like, "I should get back," and left. My heart pounded the whole way down the corridor, back to my cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the ship made me jump. Every sound in the hallway outside my door set me on edge. I told myself he was probably just some drunk trying to mess with me. But there was something in his voice, too calm, too certain. The next day I tried to forget it. I went to breakfast, sat by the window, watched families laughing over pancakes and orange juice. The world looked normal again. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. That man on the deck. That sentence he'd whispered like it was a fact, not a threat. I almost convinced myself to report it. But what would I say? Some guy on the deck made a creepy comment. Security would laugh. Maybe they'd check, maybe not. I decided to keep to myself, stay in crowded areas, and ride it out until the end of the trip. That worked until the fifth night. I had gone down to the lounge for a drink, and when I came back up, the hallway near my cabin was dark. Half the lights flickered like they were half dead. As I walked, I noticed something ahead, someone standing still, right in the middle of the corridor. My stomach tightened. As I got closer, I realized it was him. Same jacket, same hollow face. No smile, no movement, just standing there like he'd been waiting. I slowed, but I couldn't turn back. The hallway was too narrow, and I'd have to pass him to reach my cabin. He didn't speak, didn't step aside. He just kept staring as I walked past, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I slipped my keycard into the cabin door, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. I stepped inside quick, slammed the door, and locked it. I leaned against it for a long time, just listening. For a moment there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it, the sound of footsteps right outside my door. Slow. Careful, stopping just short of where I stood. I held my breath, and then after a long pause, they faded away. The next morning I tried to find him. I told myself if I saw him in daylight, maybe he'd look different, less menacing. Maybe I'd realize I'd been blowing it out of proportion. But he wasn't anywhere. Not in the restaurants, not on the deck, not in the bars. It was like he only existed at night. That evening, I stayed in my cabin, lights on, TV humming just for background noise. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. I didn't move. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized something. I couldn't hear anything from outside. Usually the hallways were alive, laughter, music, doors slamming. But that night, silence. And then 3 soft knocks at my door. Not a random banging, not some drunk by mistake. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. My throat went dry. "Who is it?" I managed to say, though my voice shook. No answer. Just silence. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute. Eventually, I backed away from the door, sat on the bed, and stayed awake until dawn. The cruise was only halfway over, but I couldn't take it anymore. The ship felt like a trap, a place I couldn't escape. I went to the front desk, asked about leaving early at the next port. They told me it wasn't possible, that once you're on, you're committed until the end. That night, I didn't sleep again. Every creak of the walls, every shift of the water made me feel like he was just outside, watching, waiting. And then on the 6th night, I finally saw him again. I had worked up the nerve to step outside, thinking maybe a walk would clear my head. The ship was quiet, the ocean black around us. I made my way to the upper deck, and there he was, standing in his spot. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Another man stood beside him, dressed the same way, leaning on the railing. When I froze in the doorway, both of them turned to look at me. Neither smiled, neither moved. I backed away slowly at first, then faster, until I was practically running. I didn't stop until I was back in my cabin, door locked, lights on. I never saw them again after that night. But I also never slept. Not really. Every shadow felt like it was bending toward me. Every noise felt deliberate. By the time the cruise ended, I stumbled off the ship like a man crawling out of a nightmare. I don't tell this story to many people, because how do you explain it? How do you describe men who seem to appear only in the hours when everyone else is asleep? And how do you explain the way one sentence still echoes in my head, years later, like he whispered it just last night? One push, that's all it takes. I was standing at the rail of the cruise ship when it all began, staring down at the black water. The ocean was calm that night, the surface smooth like glass, only cut apart by the ship's wake. To anyone else, it was a perfect holiday scene. Hundreds of people inside the lounges, laughing, drinking, dancing, while outside the cool air wrapped around me. But I wasn't much of a partier, so I found my quiet spots. I liked the sound of water more than the chatter of strangers. I'd saved up almost 2 years for this trip. It was supposed to be the highlight of my life, 10 days at sea on one of the biggest cruise liners in the world. The brochures had promised fine dining, endless entertainment, pools, gyms, casinos, even a theater with live shows every night. And they delivered. The place felt like a floating city. But after a few nights, something started gnawing at me. Something that had nothing to do with seasickness or boredom. It began small. A woman I'd seen on deck, maybe late 30s, with long dark hair and a red scarf, disappeared. Not that I noticed right away. On a ship with over 3,000 passengers, people fade into the background. But I remembered her because she'd sat at the same breakfast table as me one morning, alone, picking at a croissant. We didn't talk, but I remembered how tired her eyes looked. 3 days later, I overheard 2 of the cleaning crew whispering in Spanish near one of the lower decks. They kept repeating mujer and perdida, woman, missing. When they saw me, they froze, then quickly walked off. I should have let it go, but something about the way they looked at me as they left, nervous, like they weren't supposed to talk about it, got stuck in my head. I asked at the guest services desk later, casual as I could, if anyone had gone missing. The young man behind the counter smiled too brightly. "No, sir. Everyone's accounted for." That was the first lie. I told myself I was imagining things. That evening, I had dinner at one of the smaller restaurants on board, a dimly lit place with glass windows overlooking the endless Black Sea. Across the room, I saw 2 men in suits, not the kind of men you normally saw on a cruise ship. They weren't relaxing or laughing, just sitting stiff, heads low, talking fast. One of them looked like he'd just walked off Wall Street, slicked back hair, polished shoes. The other had a scar along his jawline. They didn't fit here, and yet something about their posture told me they were comfortable, like they owned the space. I watched them a little too long, and the scarred one noticed. His eyes met mine, sharp and unblinking. I looked down immediately. By the time I dared glance back, they were gone. The cruise had multiple decks that passengers weren't supposed to enter, sections reserved for crew only. I had no reason to go down there until the 5th night when I couldn't sleep and decided to wander. The halls were quiet, carpet muffling my footsteps. Most people were in the casino or asleep. I ended up near a door marked crew access only. A couple walked past me, laughing, not paying me any attention. The door wasn't fully shut. I don't know what possessed me, but I slipped through. The air changed instantly. It smelled different down there, metal, oil, something damp. Pipes lined the ceilings. The carpet was gone, replaced with steel floors that echoed every step. I felt out of place right away, like I had crossed into another world. I should have turned back, but I heard voices further down. I crept along, keeping close to the wall. Ahead was a half-open door spilling yellow light. I peeked through and froze. Inside was a room, not much bigger than a storage space, with tables shoved against the wall. On the tables were stacks of small boxes sealed, with numbers scrawled on them. And standing around those boxes were the 2 men I'd seen in the restaurant, slick hair and the scarred jaw. With them was a 3rd man, wearing a staff uniform, sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on his neck. They weren't just talking. They were counting money, bundles of it. The scarred man opened one of the boxes, pulled out a bag of white powder, and nodded. My stomach clenched. Drugs, a lot of them. The staff member shifted nervously, glancing toward the door. "You're moving too much of it. Someone's gonna notice." "Then keep your people quiet," Scar said, voice low but cutting. I backed away slowly, pulse hammering. The floor creaked under me. Scar's head whipped toward the door. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the passenger areas, chest heaving, sweat soaking my shirt. People passed me, some drunk, some laughing, all oblivious to what I'd just seen. I couldn't tell anyone, not without sounding insane. Who would believe me? "Hey, I saw a drug operation below deck." They'd laugh, or worse, they'd report me to the very people running it. But I knew the truth now. There was a crime ring operating right under the passengers' feet, hidden in the guts of the ship, and the staff was in on it. The next morning, I tried to keep my head down. I told myself I'd just ride out the cruise, get off when we docked, and never speak of it. But fear has a way of clinging to you. Every time I walked through the ship, I felt eyes on me, in the buffet line, in the hallways. Even out on the deck at night, I caught sight of a figure lingering too long near me before slipping away. Then, 2 nights later, something happened that forced my hand. I was heading back to my cabin when I noticed my door was slightly open. My cabin key had been in my pocket all day. Heart thudding, I pushed the door slowly. The lights were off, but I knew someone had been there. My suitcase was unzipped, clothes scattered. The small notebook where I'd scribbled some observations about the men, about the missing woman, was gone. I locked the door, sat on the bed, and tried to breathe. They knew. The paranoia drove me to dig deeper, even though it was the last thing I should have done. I started watching the crew more closely. I noticed how certain staff members avoided eye contact, how they always passed small gestures or nods near certain doors. I saw unmarked crates being wheeled through the halls at odd hours. And one night, I saw the woman with the red scarf again. She was on a lower deck, near the laundry area, walking quickly with her head down. I followed her at a distance, relief and confusion mixing in me. She wasn't missing after all. But why was she down there in the staff corridors? I watched her slip into a room. I waited, then edged closer. When the door opened again, it wasn't her who came out. It was Scar. He looked right at me, and this time he smiled. The rest of the cruise turned into a nightmare. My cabin phone rang at odd hours, silence on the other end. I'd hear footsteps following me late at night. Once, I woke up to the sound of someone rattling my cabin door handle. On the 8th day, I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I went straight to the captain's office, demanded to speak to him. The secretary looked uncomfortable but let me in. The captain listened quietly as I spilled everything, about the crates, the men, the drugs, the missing woman. His face remained unreadable. When I was done, he leaned forward. "You've seen too much," he said softly. My blood turned cold. He picked up the phone, dialed a number, and said only 2 words, "Come in." The door opened. Scar walked in. I ran before they could grab me, bolting into the halls, shoving past startled passengers. Alarms went off behind me, maybe security, maybe something worse. I didn't care. I tore through the ship, past the casino, past the theater, until I reached the lifeboats. The wind whipped hard, the ocean roaring beneath me. My only chance was to launch one of the lifeboats, even if it killed me. I fumbled with the release, heart hammering. Footsteps thundered behind me. I jumped. The icy water swallowed me whole. I don't remember much after that, just darkness, waves, and the sound of engines fading. I woke up hours later on a fishing boat, shivering, half-conscious, hauled up by men who found me floating miles from the ship. They told me the cruise liner continued on its route, business as usual, as though nothing had happened. And when the boat finally docked, I learned there had been no report of a missing passenger. According to the ship's records, I had never even been on board. I'd never been on a cruise before. The whole idea of it seemed extravagant, something other people did. Families with money, honeymooners, people celebrating retirement. I wasn't any of those. I was just trying to get away from the grind of my life for a while, working doubles at a warehouse job I hated, eating frozen dinners night after night, watching weeks blur into years. A friend convinced me this cruise was a chance to breathe. He didn't end up coming. Something about work schedules changing last minute, but I decided to go anyway. When I first stepped onto the ship, it felt overwhelming. It was massive, a floating city, polished to the point it almost didn't feel real. Pools, casinos, theaters, bars, everything you could think of to distract you from the fact that you were surrounded by nothing but ocean. For the first couple of days, I did what most people did. I ate too much, walked the decks, took photos, and stayed up late drinking cheap cocktails at the lounge. But on the third night, something happened that pulled me out of the vacation mindset for good. It was late, close to midnight, when I was heading back to my cabin. The hallways were quieter then, most people asleep or gambling below. I remember hearing footsteps behind me, steady, unhurried, matching my pace. When I glanced back, there were two men in dark suits, not exactly casual cruise wear. They weren't talking, just walking. I turned a corner toward my room, but the footsteps stayed behind me. Not closer, not farther, just steady. My cabin was near the end of the hall, and when I finally slipped in and locked the door, I pressed my ear to the metal for a moment. Silence. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Security, maybe. Staff members. Not everyone wore Hawaiian shirts and khakis on a cruise ship. But that afternoon, while cutting across one of the quieter decks to avoid the crowd around the pool, I passed by a cabin door slightly ajar. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. Inside, not far from the entrance, a girl was sitting on the floor. She looked young, late teens maybe. She had her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped tight around them. What got me was the look in her eyes. She didn't notice me, or if she did, she didn't react. Her gaze was fixed on nothing, blank, hollow. Before I could process it, the door shut fast, as if someone had yanked it closed from the inside. For hours I debated whether I'd imagined it. Maybe she was sick, maybe she was just a passenger having a bad day, but the way the door had slammed told me otherwise. That night, I heard noise in the hallway again, soft shuffling, a door creaking open. When I peered through the peephole, I caught sight of one of the suited men from before. He was guiding someone down the hall, holding their arm firmly. It wasn't until they passed under the dim hallway light that I realized it was the girl from earlier. Her head hung forward, like she was barely conscious. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, torn between stepping out and staying hidden. Something deep in my gut told me not to make a sound. The next morning, I tried asking a staff member casually if the ship had medical facilities, like maybe the girl was just under care for something. The woman at the desk smiled politely and told me the infirmary was 2 decks below, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the security camera above her head before she gave me the answer, like she was being careful. By day 5, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time I walked past that section of cabins, I felt eyes on me. Once, I caught the sound of muffled crying behind one of the doors. Another time, a man stepped out suddenly as I passed, gave me a hard look, and then pulled the door shut again. That's when it clicked. This wasn't random. Whatever was happening wasn't meant to be seen, and it wasn't just one girl. I started keeping a mental map of the hallways, which doors seemed to have activity at odd hours, who came and went. The men in suits weren't just staff, they were moving people. Always young, mostly women, sometimes men. They never appeared in public areas of the ship with them, only in the isolated halls where passengers rarely wandered. The realization hit me like cold water. They were trafficking people, using the cruise as a cover, a floating prison where no one could interfere. From then on, I couldn't relax. I stopped going to the bars, stopped lounging by the pool. I carried myself like I was invisible, but I kept watching. One night, while heading to my cabin, I noticed my door was cracked open. Just barely, but enough that I knew I hadn't left it like that. My heart pounded as I stood there, staring. When I pushed it open, the room looked normal, nothing out of place. But on my pillow was a folded piece of paper. Inside, in rough handwriting, were 2 words, "Stop looking." I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Every creak of the ship made my chest tighten. I thought about going to the captain, but if the crew was in on it, who could I trust? The next day, I decided to test something. I walked down the hall where I'd first seen the girl, this time in broad daylight, pretending to be lost. As I passed the door, it cracked open slightly, and for half a second I saw her again. This time, her lips moved. One word: help. I didn't even have time to react before the door slammed shut again. I knew then I couldn't ignore it. That night I waited until the hall was quiet. I crept toward the door I thought was hers, pressing my ear against it. I could hear movement, whispers, the shuffle of feet. Gathering courage, I knocked softly once, twice. Silence. Then a quick shuffle and the sound of someone being pulled away. Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the hall. Heavy, fast. I bolted back to my room and locked the door. A second later, there was a hard knock, 3 times, deliberate, on my cabin door. I didn't breathe. After a long pause, the footsteps moved on. By now, I knew I wasn't imagining things. They knew I'd seen too much. And if I wasn't careful, I'd end up locked behind one of those doors too. I couldn't risk waiting until the ship docked again. I had to do something while I was still on board. On the 6th night, I took a chance. I followed one of the men when he left the restricted hallway, staying far back, keeping my head down. He led me through a service stairwell and down into a part of the ship passengers weren't supposed to be in. My pulse hammered in my ears as I crept after him, sticking close to the walls. That's when I found it. A cargo hold, sealed off from passengers, with makeshift partitions inside. I didn't have to get closer to know. There were people in there. Dozens. Before I could move, before I could even think, a hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I spun around and came face to face with one of the men. His expression was calm, almost amused. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to my cabin. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but somehow I locked myself in before they caught me. For the rest of the night, I sat with my back against the door, clutching the cabin phone, debating whether to call for help. The next morning, there was a knock, light, hesitant. When I didn't answer, a voice whispered through the door, "Please, you're the only one who saw. Don't let them take us." It was the girl. My throat went dry. Before I could even get to my feet, footsteps came pounding down the hall, followed by a sharp yelp, then silence. I never saw her again. When the cruise finally docked, I walked off that ship like a ghost, blending into the crowd of happy families and sunburnt tourists. No one suspected a thing, but I knew. Somewhere below deck, in the locked cabins no one asked about, people were still trapped. And the worst part, no one would ever believe me. I never thought a cruise would leave me with a secret that could ruin lives. When I first stepped onto the ship, all I had in mind was escaping the grind of my office job, soaking in the ocean air, and maybe meeting some new people. I'd saved for months, and this was my first time on a cruise. Everything about it seemed larger than life. The endless buffets, the pools, the sheer size of the ship. It felt like a floating city where nothing bad could happen. But that illusion didn't last long. On the 3rd night, after dinner, I wandered onto one of the quieter decks. Most passengers stuck to the bars or the theater, but I'd had enough of the noise. The deck was nearly empty, just the hum of the ship's engines and the water churning below. That's when I saw 2 men dragging something across the floor near one of the service doors. At first, I thought it was luggage, but when the dim light hit it, I froze. It wasn't luggage, it was a body. They were moving fast, clearly not expecting anyone to be there. I ducked behind a column, my heart hammering. The 2 men grunted as they heaved the body, male, maybe mid-30s, dressed in casual clothes, through the service door. One of them muttered something about getting it done before shift change. Then the door shut, and they were gone. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I'd seen. Maybe it was a medical emergency. Maybe they were crew helping someone who fainted. But deep down I knew. The way they moved, the urgency in their voices, the limpness of the body, it wasn't right. I wanted to go to security immediately, but another thought stopped me cold. What if security was in on it? I didn't know who those men were. They could have been crew members. They could have been passengers. And if they were willing to kill someone on a ship with thousands of people, what would they do to keep it quiet? That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the hallway made me sit up in bed. I kept replaying the scene in my head, wondering if the man had been alive when I saw him, wondering if they'd already disposed of him somewhere in the endless ocean below. The next day, I forced myself to act normal. I ate breakfast, walked around, even joined a trivia game just to look less suspicious. but my eyes kept scanning every face, looking for the two men. It was a big ship, but eventually I spotted one of them near the pool, lounging casually with a drink in his hand, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. That chilled me more than anything. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't hiding. He was blending in perfectly. Later, I found myself near one of the crew-only hallways, pretending to be lost. A door swung open, and for just a second, I glimpsed a storage room. My stomach turned. A shoe was sticking out from under a tarp, the same kind of shoe the man had been wearing. The door shut quickly when a crew member noticed me lingering. He gave me a tight smile and said, "Passenger areas are the other way." His voice was friendly enough, but his eyes cold. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just a random killing. There were people helping to hide it, maybe even organizing it. The more I thought about going to security, the more it felt like a trap. If they were part of it, I'd be signing my own death warrant. But if I did nothing, I was complicit. I couldn't carry that weight. I started writing everything down, times, places, descriptions. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record. I slipped the notes into a book I kept in my cabin. Every night, I locked the door and pushed a chair against it, knowing it wouldn't really stop anyone if they wanted to come in. On the 6th night, it escalated. I was on my way back to my cabin when I felt someone behind me. The ship's hallways were narrow and quiet that late. Footsteps echoed. When I glanced back, I saw him, the man from the pool, the one I'd seen dragging the body. He smiled faintly like he knew me. My throat went dry. I sped up. So did he. By the time I reached my cabin, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely swipe my keycard. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and stood there listening. Silence. A soft knock. "Wrong room," he said casually through the door. "Sorry, but I knew better." He wanted me to know he'd seen me. He wanted me rattled. And it worked. For the rest of the trip, I barely left my cabin unless I had to. I ordered room service, kept the curtains closed, and slept in short, restless bursts. The ship was massive, but it felt like a prison. There was nowhere to go. No police to call. When we finally docked back home, I expected someone to confront me, to follow me, but nothing happened. Passengers filed off the ship, laughing, hugging, saying their goodbyes. I walked off too, my heart still racing, waiting for a hand on my shoulder, but it never came. I thought about going straight to the authorities, but another fear stopped me. What if they'd covered everything up by the time I got there? What if I sounded insane? I saw a body on a cruise ship, but I don't know the victim's name and I don't have proof. Who would believe me? To this day, I keep those notes in a drawer. I don't know if anyone else saw what I saw. I don't know who that man was or why he had to die. But I know this. There's a secret buried on that ship, one that nobody talks about. And I'll never set foot on a cruise again. I booked the cruise because I thought I needed a reset. My work life had been draining me, my sleep had been broken for months, and I figured a week out at sea, away from deadlines, noise, and the constant hum of the city, might clear my head. The ship was massive, nearly floating city size, with pools, theaters, endless food buffets, and cabins lined up like a giant hotel. I never imagined I'd end up fighting for my life on it. From the moment I stepped on board, everything felt larger than life. The glass elevators rose over the lobby like something out of a sci-fi movie. Families posed for photos, couples clinked champagne glasses, and kids darted around, already treating the place like a playground. I found my cabin, dropped my bag, and stepped onto the balcony. The port was shrinking behind us, cranes and warehouses giving way to nothing but sea. I remember thinking it would be impossible for anything to go wrong out here. Too many people, too much order, too much money wrapped up in this floating palace. That thought wouldn't last long. The first 2 days were uneventful. I woke early, ran on the top deck track while the sunrise painted the horizon, then wandered down for coffee and eggs. I read on the sun deck, had a couple beers by the pool, and struck up small talk with other passengers. Everyone seemed happy, relaxed, in vacation mode. I let myself sink into that rhythm, but on the 3rd night, just past midnight, I saw something I couldn't shake. I couldn't sleep and went for a walk along one of the quieter corridors on Deck 5. Most of the ship was asleep, the usual chatter and music replaced by the hum of the engines and the occasional squeak of the hull adjusting against the waves. Rounding a corner, I noticed 3 men dressed in crew uniforms, white shirts, black pants, radios clipped to their belts. Nothing unusual, except they weren't walking like crew. They were moving fast, whispering in bursts, constantly looking over their shoulders. And they weren't headed toward any staff-only doors. They were cutting through passenger areas, almost like they were avoiding somewhere else. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe they were dealing with a plumbing issue or a medical emergency. But then one of them pulled something from under his jacket. It looked like a metal pipe at first, but as the light caught, I saw it wasn't. It was a weapon. I froze in the shadow of an alcove until they disappeared into a stairwell. My heart pounded so loud I thought someone might hear it. I hurried back to my cabin, locked the door, and paced the small space. Who do you even tell something like that? Security? The front desk? If I called and said I saw a crew with weapons, would anyone believe me, or would I sound drunk or paranoid? The next morning, everything looked normal. Kids splashed in the pools, waiters carried trays of drinks, the cruise director cracked jokes over the loudspeaker. I almost convinced myself I'd misread the whole thing. But later, when I went down to the atrium, I spotted one of those same men. He wasn't fixing anything. He wasn't guiding passengers. He was just standing near the bar, watching. Not drinking, not chatting, just scanning the room like he was memorizing it. When his eyes passed over me, my stomach tightened. He looked at me a second too long. That night, the ship's atmosphere shifted. I'd been in the theater watching a comedy show when the lights flickered. Just once, then again, then they went completely out. A few screams, then nervous laughter as emergency lights kicked on. The comedian tried to joke through it, but then a voice came over the intercom. It wasn't the captain or the cruise director. It was someone else. "Attention passengers," the voice said, calm but cold. "Remain seated and quiet. The ship is now under our control. Cooperate and no one gets hurt." Chaos broke out. People gasped, shouted. Some tried to run, but armed men stormed into the theater almost instantly. They weren't wearing masks, just the same crew uniforms I'd seen. Guns in their hands, eyes sharp. "Sit down," one barked. A man in the front row tried to argue, and they knocked him across the face with the butt of a rifle. Blood sprayed across the floor, and that shut everyone up. It wasn't just the theater. Through the doors I could hear shouting, crying, orders being barked in accented English. They weren't bluffing. They really had taken the ship. Hours blurred together after that. The hijackers herded us into common areas, lounges, theaters, dining halls. They ordered everyone to sit, then moved through the crowd, collecting phones, jewelry, wallets. "Ship will change course," one of them announced. "No one move, no one resists, and you'll live." I kept my head down, my hands steady, but inside I was shaking. A hijacking, on a cruise ship, out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody could help us. I started noticing things, though. Patterns. They weren't everywhere. There were maybe 20 of them total, scattered through a ship holding thousands. They couldn't cover every hallway, every stairwell, every cabin. They relied on fear and shock, and some passengers were already whispering, quietly, carefully. I picked up on it. A group of us, all strangers, were thinking the same thing. Maybe we could fight back. That idea scared me more than sitting still. If we failed, we'd be executed, thrown overboard, who knew? But if we did nothing, we were hostages at sea, and these men had a plan that went far beyond robbery. On the 4th day, they made their move. Through cracks in the curtains, I could see the horizon. We weren't heading toward any port. We were veering deeper into open water. Rumors spread. Ransom, trafficking, some deal with a rogue state. Nobody knew, but it was clear we weren't going home. That night, in the dining hall, I slipped away under the excuse of using the bathroom. I wasn't alone. A man named Brian and a woman named Elena followed. In hushed voices, we admitted what we'd seen. The hijackers had blind spots. The aft stairwell wasn't guarded all the time. A storage room near the kitchen held tools. We had no weapons, but we had numbers, and numbers might mean something. We decided to wait until the next shift change, midnight. That was when they moved positions, and gaps opened. When the time came, my legs nearly gave out from nerves, but I forced myself forward. We slipped into the stairwell, then down toward the lower deck. Brian grabbed a wrench from the storage room. Elena found a heavy fire extinguisher. My hands closed on a thick flashlight, cold and solid. We were just 3, but we weren't the only ones. Word had spread. Another 5 joined us in the shadows, all desperate enough to risk it. We heard footsteps coming. 2 guards, laughing about something, rifles slung loose. We lunged. It was fast, brutal, messy. The wrench cracked one man's skull. The extinguisher blasted into the other's chest. They went down, and before either could scream, we were on them, muffling, striking, making sure they couldn't recover. I'll never forget the sound of it, the way the ship's hum drowned out their last breaths. We took their radios and guns. Suddenly we weren't just passengers anymore. We were fighters. We split up, moving quietly through the ship, listening to the hijackers chatter. They were panicking. They knew some of us had resisted. That was our chance. Fights broke out in bursts across the ship. Hallways turned into battle zones, dining rooms into barricades. Passengers outnumbered them 10 to 1, and once we'd armed ourselves, the hijackers started losing control. But they didn't go quietly. They fired into crowds, threatened to blow the engines, screamed that they'd sink us all. The final standoff happened near the bridge. The leader, the man whose voice had been on the intercom, barricaded himself inside with 2 others. They had the captain tied up, bloodied but alive. Through the glass we could see his mouth moving, yelling at us not to rush. "Back or we kill him." For minutes nobody moved. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. Then Elena whispered, "They're bluffing. They need him alive to steer the ship." She was right. That was their weak point. We forced the door. Shots fired, glass shattered. The captain dropped to the floor, crawling. The hijackers panicked, trying to reload, but Brian charged, swinging his wrench like a madman. I raised the gun we'd stolen and fired without thinking. The sound was deafening, the recoil brutal, but the man went down. The others followed quickly. It was over. By dawn, the remaining hijackers were tied up in the lounge under guard. The captain took back the intercom, voice shaking as he told us we were safe. "The ship is ours again," he said. People cried, hugged strangers, collapsed from exhaustion. I stood there, the gun still in my hand, staring at the blood on the floor, unsure if I should feel relief or guilt. We made it back to port 2 days later, escorted by Navy ships that had been scrambled once we regained communications. The hijackers were dragged off in chains. Reporters swarmed the dock, but I didn't speak. What could I say? That I'd come on a cruise for rest and ended up killing a man to survive? That out in the middle of the ocean, far from any law or safety, it felt like the world had stopped existing except for us and them. I haven't booked another trip since. I don't think I ever will. When I close my eyes, I still see their faces. I still hear the intercom announcing the ship was theirs. And I still remember the moment when fear gave way to something darker. The part of me that knew the only way to live was to fight like hell. I had signed on to the cruise because I needed a break from work. I figured 10 days at sea would be the reset I'd been craving. The first few nights were peaceful, endless blue water, open decks, dinners that stretched into the evening. But halfway through the trip, something shifted. It started as a small rumor, whispered around the pool bar. A bartender told a couple at the counter that one of the ship's engine alarms had gone off the night before. Nothing major, he assured them. Just a sensor glitch. But the couple mentioned it later to their friends at dinner, and by the next morning, the whole deck was buzzing. People said they'd felt a vibration in their cabins, like the floor was humming too strongly. I wouldn't have thought much of it if I hadn't felt it myself. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint rattling, my glass of water on the nightstand shaking just slightly. When I pressed my palm against the wall, I could feel a low, uneven thrum. By morning, it was gone. At breakfast, I overheard 2 men at the next table talking in hushed voices. They said someone had seen crew members wheeling equipment into the lower decks that didn't look like it belonged on a passenger ship. One of them even suggested sabotage. The other brushed it off, but I noticed the way he lowered his voice when he said it. That word stuck with me all day, sabotage. It made the ship feel different, less like a floating hotel, more like a target. By evening, I couldn't shake the unease. I went for a walk down one of the quieter hallways that led to the service areas. The usual chatter of vacationers was gone, and all I could hear was the muffled thrum of the engines deep below. At one point, I thought I heard hurried footsteps behind a locked door, followed by the metallic clang of something dropped. I leaned closer, and for a moment I swore I could hear voices. Quick, tense, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. When I backed away, I nearly bumped into a crew member. He smiled politely, but his eyes lingered on me just a second too long, as if he knew I'd been listening. The next night, things escalated. Just after midnight, alarms went off in the distance. Not the loud evacuation alarms, but sharp metallic beeps echoing from somewhere below deck. I slipped out into the hallway and saw 3 crew members running past, carrying tools. I asked one what was happening, but he just shook his head and said, "Stay in your cabin, please." I didn't. Something about the way he said it felt wrong. I followed at a distance, trailing them down a stairwell until I reached a part of the ship that was off limits to passengers. I stayed hidden at the landing, listening. One of them was furious, his voice cutting through the hum of machinery. "If it goes down again, people will notice. We can't keep covering it." The others argued in sharp whispers, words blending with the rumble of the engines. I couldn't catch everything, but I heard enough. Sabotage, power grid, backup system. That was the first time it sank in. This wasn't paranoia. Someone was actually tampering with the ship. The following day, the captain made an announcement that there had been a minor technical difficulty overnight, but assured everyone the cruise would continue as normal. His calm tone didn't match what I'd seen or what I'd overheard. By then, I wasn't the only one noticing. A man at my dinner table, traveling alone, leaned closer and whispered, "You hear about the wiring?" I played dumb, and he smirked like he saw right through me. He said he'd worked in maritime security before and could tell when things didn't add up. "This isn't an accident," he muttered. "Somebody wants this ship compromised." I didn't sleep well after that. Every creak of the ship sounded sharper, every vibration in the walls heavier. I started carrying a flashlight in my pocket at night, just in case. 2 nights later, the lights went out. It only lasted 30 seconds, maybe less, but in that time, the hallways were pitch black and the silence was absolute. No engines, no hum, nothing. Just the sound of people yelling in the dark. When the lights snapped back on, crew members rushed down the hall, assuring passengers it was just a test. A test at 2 in the morning? The man from dinner was right. Someone was sabotaging the systems. From then on, paranoia spread like fire. Passengers started whispering in the bars, speculating about who could be behind it. Some blamed rival companies, others said it was terrorists. A few insisted it was an inside job. I kept catching sight of the same crew member, the one who'd found me near the service hallway. He was everywhere. Watching from the railing, appearing in dining areas, even passing me on the stairwells. Always the same polite smile, always those watchful eyes. On the 8th night, I saw him again, this time entering a restricted stairwell with 2 others. I followed at a distance and found myself deep in the lower decks. The air was hotter there, full of the oily tang of machinery. I crouched behind a crate and watched them kneeling over an open electrical panel. One of them was splicing wires, another held a flashlight, the third, my watcher, kept glancing over his shoulder, his jaw tight. When I leaned too far forward, my foot slipped against the crate. The clang echoed like a gunshot. The flashlight swung toward me. For a second, I froze. Then I ran. I could hear them chasing me down the metal corridor, footsteps pounding. I didn't look back. I just sprinted until I reached a stairwell and shoved through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The next morning, nothing was said, no announcement, no word of the blackout, no mention of alarms. But I knew they knew I'd seen too much. From that point on, I avoided the lower decks. I stuck to crowded areas, always keeping people around me. But it didn't help the gnawing feeling that something was building, that the sabotage wasn't finished. On the final night of the cruise, just after midnight, the alarms blared again. This time, they weren't distant. They shook the walls, shrill and urgent. Passengers stumbled into the halls in panic as the lights flickered overhead. For a terrifying minute, I thought the ship was going to die under us, that the sabotage had finally worked. But then, as suddenly as it began, everything steadied. The lights brightened, the engines roared back, and the alarms cut off. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calmer than ever. "False alarm," he said. "There is no danger." But I knew better. I could still see the fear in the crew's eyes. I could still hear the running footsteps below deck. The sabotage had failed, or maybe it had only half succeeded. Either way, I left that ship with the distinct heavy knowledge that someone had tried to bring it down, and that the truth had been buried under the captain's soothing voice and the passengers' desperate need to believe him. And I'll never forget the smile of that crew member when I disembarked, standing by the exit ramp, watching me go as if to say, "You saw, and you'll never prove it." I booked the cruise because I needed an escape. Work had drained me, life felt stale, and the glossy brochures promised relaxation and a taste of adventure. I pictured lazy days at sea, quiet evenings with a drink in my hand, and maybe a conversation with someone interesting. Nothing about this trip suggested danger, let alone what I would end up stumbling into. The ship was massive, almost overwhelming at first glance. My cabin was simple, a small window looking out at the endless water. The first night, I wandered around to get a feel for the place. Crowds shuffled between buffets, music pulsed from a lounge, and families took pictures in the long carpeted halls. Everything seemed normal, but I remember now the way the staff moved, some too hurried, some avoiding eye contact, like there were places on the ship they weren't supposed to mention. I wouldn't have noticed if not for one thing. Around midnight, after losing track of time at the bar, I tried to find my way back. I took a wrong turn, went down the wrong staircase, and ended up in a corridor that didn't look like it was meant for passengers. The walls weren't carpeted, just plain metal. The hum of the engines was louder. I realized I'd wandered into crew-only areas, so I turned around. Just before leaving, I noticed a door that wasn't marked. A man in uniform appeared suddenly, almost bumping into me. He smiled quickly, too quickly, and blocked my view of the door. "Lost?" he asked. I nodded, embarrassed, and he directed me back upstairs. But his behavior stuck in my head. His smile had no warmth in it. It was more like a warning, "Don't come back here." For the next 2 days, I ignored it. I tried to enjoy the pools, the shows, the dinners. I even talked to a woman named Elena, traveling alone as well, and we shared breakfast a couple of times. But every now and then, I'd catch that same crew member in the distance, glancing my way, as if making sure I wasn't curious again. On the third night, I woke up at 2 a.m. My cabin felt stifling, and I couldn't sleep. I went walking. Most decks were quiet, with only the hum of the ship and the occasional shuffle of cleaning staff. I ended up near the lower levels again. That same unmarked door caught my eye. Something in me wanted to push my luck. I checked around. No one. I turned the handle. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. Inside was a stairwell, lit dimly, leading down. The air smelled different, like dust and machinery. I hesitated, then went down a few steps. Voices drifted up, faint but clear enough, men speaking quickly, their tones serious. I should have turned back, but I crept lower, careful not to make noise. At the bottom, I reached another door. Through a narrow gap, I saw into a wide room. And what I saw didn't make sense. There were tables arranged in rows, each with objects displayed, jewelry, watches, even weapons. Men in suits and women in dresses walked around, examining items. It looked like an auction house, but hidden deep inside the cruise ship. At the far end, a man in a sharp suit stood at a podium, announcing bids in a calm but firm voice. People raised small cards, numbers on them. My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't a normal auction. These weren't just antiques or collectibles. I saw something that froze me. A case with passports, credit cards, and IDs neatly arranged. Another table displayed what looked like prescription drugs in bulk. And then something worse. One of the attendants wheeled out a small cage. Inside it was a boy, maybe 12, terrified and silent. My chest tightened. I backed away from the door, breath shaky. I couldn't process what I was seeing. A black market auction on this ship hidden right under the passengers' feet. Jewelry, drugs, stolen identities, and even people. As I turned to leave, the stair creaked under my foot. The voices inside paused. Panic surged through me. I hurried back up, trying not to run, but the door above burst open. The same crew member from before stepped into the stairwell, staring right at me. He didn't smile this time. He grabbed my arm hard, pulling me close. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was low and dangerous. I stammered an apology, trying to play dumb. I got lost. I thought this was. Save it, he cut me off. You saw too much. I yanked free and bolted. My footsteps thundered as I sprinted back to the passenger levels, weaving through hallways until I reached the safety of crowded spaces. I didn't look back. For the rest of the night, I locked myself in my cabin, trembling. Every sound in the hall made me flinch. I knew I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? If the crew was involved, who could I trust? The next day, I tried to act normal, but paranoia gnawed at me. The crew member kept appearing, sometimes at a distance, sometimes closer, always watching. At lunch, I saw him speaking with 2 other staff members, and they all glanced my way. I thought of going to Elena. Maybe she would believe me. But dragging her into this felt dangerous. That night, I couldn't resist. I needed proof. Something to show the world what was happening. I slipped my phone into my pocket and went back. I waited until the corridor was empty, then opened that unmarked door again. My hands shook as I descended, heart hammering. This time, I pressed my phone camera against the gap in the door. I caught a few seconds of footage. The podium, the people bidding, the cages in the corner. Enough to prove I wasn't crazy. Then a hand grabbed the back of my shirt and yanked me away. The crew member snarled in my face, eyes furious. You don't learn, do you? He shoved me against the wall. You think you can just take this upstairs? I tried to fight back, elbowing him hard. He stumbled, and I bolted again. But this time, 2 more men appeared at the top of the stairs. I barely slipped past them, sprinting through the hallways with them chasing me. I crashed into a group of drunk passengers, scattering them, which gave me just enough cover to lose the men in the chaos. I raced back to my cabin, locked the door, and collapsed on the floor. I had the video. But what good was it if they got to me first? The next day was the longest of my life. I stayed in crowded areas, never alone. I noticed the men shadowing me, blending in as crew, but always there. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. The cruise still had 4 days left. 4 days stuck on a floating prison with people who wanted me dead. I tried to send the video online, but the ship's Wi-Fi was too weak and restricted. Email, social media, everything kept failing. By the 5th night, I was exhausted, running on nerves. I decided I needed to confide in someone. Elena was my only option. I found her on deck, watching the ocean. I pulled her aside and told her everything, quietly, quickly, desperate for someone to believe me. She looked at me, pale and stunned. Then she whispered, "I've seen something too." She described noticing strange movements of staff at night, passengers disappearing from cabins. She hadn't gone as far as I did, but she suspected something was off. We agreed to stick together. 2 people were safer than 1, but safety was an illusion. That night, as we headed back to our cabins, the lights in the corridor flickered. The crew member appeared again, with 2 others. They blocked our path. "You should have stayed out of this," he said coldly. We ran. Elena and I sprinted down the hall, hearts racing, shoving past anyone in our way. The men followed, relentless. We darted through stairwells, onto different decks, slipping into a storage room. We pressed against the wall, listening to footsteps pounding past. My phone was still in my pocket. The video was still there. We had proof, but now it was a matter of survival until we reached port. For the next 3 days, we barely slept. We stayed near groups of passengers, avoided dark hallways, and never let each other out of sight. The men kept circling, waiting for us to slip up. When the ship finally docked, I felt my legs go weak with relief. But as we walked down the gangway, I saw them one last time, standing on deck, watching us, expressionless. We never spoke of it again, but Elena and I both knew we'd stumbled onto something bigger than either of us. And to this day, I still wonder how many passengers went missing on that ship, written off as accidents or wanderers, while the black market auction carried on just below our feet. When I boarded the cruise ship, I expected the usual: buffets, live music, days spent on the deck staring at the ocean, and nights filled with drinks under neon lights. I wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, I had taken the trip to get away from it. A long shift at work, bills stacking up, and a breakup that left me drained had all pushed me to book this cruise as a way to breathe again. At first, it was everything I hoped for. The first 2 nights felt like a dream. My cabin was small but cozy, the food was endless, and I met people who were just as eager to escape reality as I was. But then, slowly, little things started bothering me. It began with noises at night, not the kind you'd expect from a ship this size. No hum of machinery, no clinking pipes. These were faint thuds, almost like something or someone being moved. Sometimes it was followed by a dragging sound. At first, I brushed it off as maintenance, but when I asked a crew member about it, he avoided my eyes and said, "Best to keep your door locked at night." That answer should have alarmed me, but instead it lit a spark of curiosity. On the third night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the same dragging sound again. This time, I decided to follow it. I slipped out of my cabin barefoot, careful not to make noise, and walked down the corridor. The ship was eerily quiet, no footsteps, no chatter, no music from the bars. Just the sound of the ocean outside and that faint dragging. The noise led me to a part of the ship I hadn't noticed before. A stairwell that wasn't on the map they gave passengers. I followed it down, lower and lower, until the carpeted floors turned to plain metal and the walls smelled faintly of chemicals. My heart pounded in my chest, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I reached a steel door that was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I saw fluorescent light and movement inside. I pushed the door open just enough to peek in. What I saw froze me in place. There were people strapped to gurneys, at least 5 of them. Their mouths gagged, their wrists tied down, IVs dripping into their arms. They weren't tourists. They looked weak, pale, and terrified. Around them stood men in medical coats, but something about their movements was wrong. They weren't caring for them. They were testing something. One of them injected a syringe into a man's arm, then stepped back and watched as the man convulsed. The convulsions stopped after a minute. The man lay still. One of the doctors casually wrote something on a clipboard and motioned for 2 others to drag the body away like it was garbage. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't medical care. This was experimentation. I backed away as quietly as I could, my hands trembling. I wanted to run, to scream, to alert someone, but who would believe me? These weren't random criminals. This was organized. The fact that this kind of operation could exist on a ship full of thousands of passengers told me one thing. The crew was involved, or at least complicit. I tried to act normal the next day, but paranoia ate at me. I kept looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone had seen me at the door. Every crew member's glance felt sharper, heavier. At breakfast, I overheard a couple at the next table mention that their friend hadn't returned to his cabin the night before. They laughed it off, assuming he had crashed in someone else's room after drinking. But I knew better. On the 5th night, I decided to test how far this went. I struck up a conversation with a bartender, asking if anyone ever went missing on cruises like this. He froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Sometimes people jump," he said. "Too much alcohol, too much ocean." His tone was rehearsed, like he had said it 100 times before. That night, the noises returned. This time I stayed put, door locked, heart hammering in my chest. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps stop outside my cabin. A soft knock followed. Then a voice. "Sir, routine check, open up." My entire body went rigid. I hadn't called for any service. I didn't move, didn't answer. After a moment, the knock repeated, louder, then silence. A minute later, footsteps retreated. The next morning, I found a small slip of paper shoved under my door. It only had 4 words written in shaky handwriting. "They know you saw." I didn't eat. I didn't leave my room. My mind raced with possibilities. Did someone else witness what I did? Or was this a trap, a way to see if I would panic? Either way, I knew I couldn't just wait for them to come for me. On the 6th day, I decided to make a move. I blended in with the crowd during an evening show and slipped away toward the lower decks. If I could gather proof, photos, videos, maybe I'd have a chance once we docked. I reached the hidden stairwell again, heart pounding harder with every step. When I reached the steel door, I pulled out my phone and carefully eased it open. What I saw was worse than before. This time, there were more patients. 10, maybe 12, strapped down, some barely conscious. A woman screamed as a needle was forced into her arm. The doctor didn't even flinch. He whispered something to another, and they scribbled notes while her body shook. I raised my phone and hit record, my hand trembling so hard the video shook. I zoomed in on their faces, their movements, the terrified victims. My breath caught when one of the men looked up, straight toward the door. I slammed it shut and ran. My footsteps echoed through the stairwell as I bolted back up to the safer levels. By the time I reached my cabin, sweat soaked through my shirt. My phone showed the video saved, though the audio was faint. It was enough. It had to be. But then came the announcement. A calm voice over the intercom. "Attention passengers, please remain in your cabins for a routine safety inspection. Crew will be conducting checks shortly. Routine inspection." Just like the voice at my door. My stomach churned. They were coming. I locked the door, shoved a chair against it, and opened my phone. No signal. Of course not. They controlled everything on this ship. Footsteps in the hall, knocks on doors, screams in the distance. When they reached mine, the knocking was harder this time. "Sir, open the door immediately." I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocking turned into pounding, then silence. Then faintly, the sound of a key sliding into the lock. I gripped my phone tight, backing into the corner. If I don't make it off this ship, maybe the phone will. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe they'll know what happened here. Because this cruise wasn't an escape, it was a trap. And I was next in line for their experiments. I thought cruising would be simple. 10 days at sea, no work emails, no city stress, just endless water and sunshine. I didn't expect my life to spiral into a nightmare in the middle of the Atlantic. It started the evening of the third day. I was having dinner in the main dining hall, a massive room with polished wood and crystal chandeliers that caught the dim lights just right. People laughed and clinked glasses, oblivious to anything dangerous. I should have felt relaxed, but something in the air felt off. The servers moved with unusual precision, their eyes scanning constantly, as though expecting trouble. I dismissed it. Maybe I was just jittery from the constant ocean sway. Later, I went to the bar to unwind. That's when I first noticed the men. They weren't part of the staff, at least not officially. Dark suits, earpieces, moving in pairs, scanning the room like predators. I assumed they were security, hired for some VIPs, but something about the way they studied the crowd felt wrong. The warning signs became undeniable around 10 p.m. The ship's lights flickered twice, briefly plunging the room into darkness. When they came back, one of the men in a suit was standing behind a couple at a table, speaking so quietly that only I noticed the woman's face go pale. The man grabbed her arm, and she stiffened. I felt a chill. Something was happening. I tried to alert a server, but before I could, the alarms went off, not the usual blaring of a safety drill. This was sharp, loud, and urgent. Screams echoed through the hall as emergency lights painted red across the polished floor. Within seconds, the suited men drew weapons, not huge guns, just small, precise handguns, and ordered everyone to the center of the dining hall. Panic erupted. Families screamed, children cried, people scrambled for exits. The crew, who were supposed to guide us, froze. Or maybe they were in on it. I couldn't tell. I ducked behind a buffet table with a few others who had reacted quickly. My hands shook, adrenaline coursing through my veins. One of the men with a gun barked commands, demanding everyone stay put and quiet. Anyone who tried to move was met with a slap of the gun's barrel. I kept my head down, heart hammering, thinking about escape. But the hall was a cage. Doors were blocked, exits guarded. My mind raced. Who were these people? Pirates? Criminals? Or something worse? The night stretched on in terrifying slow motion. They separated the passengers, moving families into different rooms, locking doors, and selecting individuals. I was shoved into a smaller lounge with a handful of other adults. One man was clutching a briefcase, muttering to himself. Another woman rocked a child in her arms, whispering promises she didn't believe. I realized quickly that the men had knowledge, detailed knowledge, about the ship. They went straight to areas that allowed them to control lights, elevators, and communications. My phone didn't work. Every exit was blocked electronically or physically. We were trapped. Hours passed. The sounds of other passengers screaming, pleading, and crying filled the halls. I kept track of time by the ship's subtle sway and the occasional clink of glasses from the VIP lounge above us, where I assumed the attackers were stationed. Eventually, one of the men came in. He was younger, probably early 30s, and looked almost bored, like this was routine for him. He scanned us, eyes cold, calculating. Then he spoke, calm but chilling. "Cooperate, and no one gets hurt. Resist." And he trailed off, letting the threat linger. We nodded, pretending compliance, though my stomach knotted with fear. It was then I noticed something important. One of the other hostages, a stocky man in his 40s, had been quietly assessing the situation, memorizing patterns of the men's movements. His eyes met mine, and he nodded subtly. I knew he was thinking the same as me. Survival meant action. We whispered plans. Timing was crucial. We couldn't overpower them. There were too many, and they were armed. But if we could isolate one at a time, we might have a chance. I spent the next hours observing, noting rotations, security blind spots, and which doors had locks we could manipulate. Each small movement felt like a lifetime. Every sound from the corridors made my stomach drop. Finally, near the early hours of the morning, we saw our opportunity. A small crew of hostiles had moved to the upper decks, leaving the lounge under minimal supervision. The stocky man whispered a quick plan. We'd overpower one, take his keys and weapon, then free as many as we could. I followed instructions, adrenaline sharpening my focus. When one guard approached to check on us, we struck, hard, fast, and coordinated. He barely had time to react. We took his keys, grabbed the small handgun, and locked the doors behind us. The others were terrified but compliant as we guided them to a more secure area. Using the guard's keycard, we began unlocking nearby cabins, quietly moving families into one area while avoiding attention. But the danger wasn't over. The attackers quickly realized something was wrong. Shouts echoed through the halls. Footsteps pounded, and we heard the unmistakable clicks of weapons being readied. We had to move. Using maintenance corridors I'd glimpsed earlier, we navigated through the lower decks, carrying children, elderly passengers, anyone who could walk. The ship groaned under our weight, and each turn in the hall could have been our last. Somewhere in the chaos, I realized the ship's bridge had been compromised. They were controlling navigation, possibly intending to head to international waters where no one could intervene. The thought made my stomach churn. We had to reach the bridge. We fought through panic, keeping low, dodging patrols, using crew uniforms we had grabbed from rooms along the way. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. Finally, we reached the door to the bridge. The remaining attackers were inside, trying to manage the ship's systems. Using the element of surprise, the stocky man and I burst in, shouting and brandishing the gun. There was a struggle, brief but intense, but we managed to subdue the two remaining men long enough to lock them in the engine room. I grabbed the ship's radio and sent an emergency signal. My voice was shaky but clear, telling authorities about the hostage situation, the armed attackers, and the locations of the passengers. The response was swift. Helicopters appeared over the horizon within an hour, their spotlights cutting through the night. Coast Guard personnel rappelled down, securing the decks and rounding up the attackers. I collapsed on the bridge floor, exhausted, my hands shaking. Around me, passengers huddled in terror, some crying, some silently thanking us. The aftermath was surreal. The attackers were questioned, and I later learned they were part of a criminal group specializing in ransom and smuggling operations, using cruise ships as temporary safe zones. Our actions had saved countless lives, but the knowledge that such danger existed on what should have been a relaxing vacation left a scar I couldn't erase. When the ship finally docked and authorities escorted everyone off safely, I felt a mix of relief and lingering paranoia. I knew I'd never see cruising the same way again. Every ship, every crowded hall, every quiet stairwell could hide something dark. I walked off the gangway, blinking at the sunlight and the calm harbor, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The screams, the shouts, the sense of utter helplessness. And I knew, deep down, that I had changed forever. That cruise was supposed to be an escape. Instead, it became a lesson in human fear, survival, and the thin line between safety and chaos.